Hello, good afternoon, good evening, good morning to everyone who is joining, depending on the time zone you are joining from. Thanks to all of you for joining us in our 30-second meetup. And it would be, there is a echo, I think. Okay. Okay. So it's like today we have Kriti with us. She would be helping us to go through this interesting topic of introduction to model risk management from an ethical AI standpoint. That's definitely a very, I would say, interesting topic of today's timeline. And over to you, Kriti. Starting with a short intro, and then we can go to the presentation and understand and learn about this topic.
All right. Hey everyone. Thanks for tuning in on a Saturday. It means a lot to us as a community and as speakers if people actually find time on a weekend to try and discuss and learn about something new. So kudos to everyone who's tuned into any session, not just my session, any session at all. Thanks Kaggle Delhi. Thanks Aeon for reaching out and making this session possible. It kind of means a lot if we get to present things that we're passionate about outside of work. I'll just start with a brief introduction about how I came to work in model risk management and what is my background. So I have a BTech in computer science followed by an MBA, and I've been working in the field of data science for 3.5 years now. And most of my work ex has been in analytics. So, what generally happens is across domains, I've worked with analytics, and one thing is constant that we see everywhere, that a lot of our models that we build have to be used in a high stakes setting. As in, a model that I build today will be deciding someone's healthcare decisions or their financial decisions or something at some point in time down the line. So, over time, I came to know about ethical AI and all of those things, and I've been a very strong advocate for usage of responsible and ethical AI. And yeah, I'm happy to be talking to everyone being here today. Thanks. That would be it. I think we'll start with the presentation, Yon.
Yes, we should start. Yes.
Great. All right. I'll just start with the presentation per se. Okay, so as the title suggests, it is about machine learning model risk management. Now, I have a few technical definitions here, but we will look into it as we move forward. Okay. So, starting with the very basics, what is machine learning and what is a brief history of machine learning? Now, before we start to discuss as to where we are going, it is important to look at where we are coming from. So, I'll take all of you back to 1950s, wherein IBM develops an AI to play a game of checkers. At that point in time, of course, they did not call it an AI. There was a guy who coined the term machine learning 3 years later, but he just called it a computer program that learns by watching people play checkers and then ultimately learns to play checker by itself. So that is where we started. Then research picked up about neural network, machine learning, artificial intelligence, and all of those things that we see today. But sometime around the early 1980s, a branch of computer vision researchers said that okay, neural network sounds very good in theory, but I don't think we will get any closer to building this as a platform at any point in our lives. So they said that okay, let's put an end to this research and let's move on to something more exciting and other things. But from 1980s to 2022, it's been 40 years, and we know where we stand in machine learning as of today. Everywhere that you see, everywhere, if you look around yourself, you will see algorithms, you will see machine learning platforms, you will see analytics solutions driving and controlling our lives in a good way and in a not so good way, almost 24 hours round the clock. My day starts with asking Google to switch on my lights, and it ends with the same thing by asking Google to switch off my lights. So that is the expanse of machine learning and AI that we have seen in just 40 years. And to come to think of it, that human history, recorded history, is at least 3,000, 4,000 years old. Think of how much we have achieved in the last 40 years, even if it is a very small fraction of our entire timeline. Okay, so since we're already talking about history, this is one thing that we hear in our class 5, class 6, or any other primary grade schools, that Humans and most machines have
Kriti,
coexist.
sorry to
Yeah,
interrupt. Are you changing the slides? Because we are still on the first slide.
I actually did not, but I'll just reshare my screen. I saw that something happened. I'll just reshare my screen. Wait.
Sure, sure, sure.
No, I actually did not change the slides up until now, but
Or
I think
it
I'll do
like
that now.
I saw screen frozen kind of thing at my end, so that's why I just wanted to check.
All right, I will just share again. Could be a connectivity issue actually. All right. Is this fine now? Okay, this is not what I was aiming for, but all right.
Yes, yes. No, ठीक है, ठीक है, ठीक है.
I'll I'll start from here. All right. So, since we are talking about where we have come from, it is imperative to talk about a few other machines that came way before AI so that we understand the relationship humans have had with machines for centuries. So, humans and machines have coexisted for centuries, even if it means as simple as building a wheel to as complex as building factories. The discovery of fire was probably a turning stone in our history, and the rest, as they say, is history. So, if harnessed correctly, it has actually changed the world for the most part. People learned about fires the first time watching forest fires, at least in theory, and then they tried to replicate it. But they have seen the amount of damage it can do if left untamed. So, they actually built in control mechanisms so that they can control what to use fire for, how to use it, and more importantly, how to put it out and how to start it on command. Okay. And we have seen that any kind of technology or any kind of piece of tech is in itself a creation. It has no moral sense of judgment. It has no sense of what can go right and what can go wrong. It is just energy. And energy can actually bring nations down. This picture, for reference, is the image of the atom bomb that was dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. All right. So, coming to our exact topic today, I'll start by introducing the terms that make up risk and management. Risk, in definition, is the possibility, and pay attention to the word possibility, of something dangerous or unpleasant, which is in general undesirable, happening. A situation that can be dangerous or have a bad result or an unintended consequence. Again, pay attention to the word possibility. Risk by itself does not mean that something has gone wrong, but just that there exists a possibility of something going wrong. Risk management, in the nutshell, became to be formalized when strategic management and all of those academic practices picked up. It is a systematic process of identifying, assessing, and controlling threats to an organization's capital and earnings. When I say organizational, it is a very capitalistic definition, but it could also apply to an individual or anyone at hand. So, if I talk about risk management as a person, for right now, if I wear a mask, that is risk management for me. Okay. Now comes the part as to why we are talking about risk management in machine learning and analytics today. So it is imperative to say that machine learning is all pervasive at the moment, and it controls more of our lives at this point than at any other point in time. Now, most of us as machine learning practitioners or as people who use machine learning outputs in general know that whenever you make any kind of predictions through an algorithm or through a program or through an agent, if it is a reinforcement learning use case, you actually account for a certain error in the model itself, because a mathematical model or a machine learning model does not exactly replicate the process that is happening. It has one job, that is to imitate the input to output conversion that it has been fed. So this is a graph. If you're familiar with the bias variance trade-off, this is a graph that shows you that how generalization error varies if you decrease the bias or you increase the variance. So there is a sweet spot between bias and variance. I'll not go into the details of this term right now. I'll do it when we talk about the next part of this slide. What bias and variance stand for is, bias measures what is the distance between actual value and the predicted value. So if you think of it as a prediction model, if you're building a prediction model that predicts if someone will go out and vote, bias would be the legal age of voting in that country. Now, variance actually measures the difference between actual prediction and the data points around it. So ideally, what you want to do is you want to balance the bias and the variance. You don't want a bias or variance, either one of them, too high or too low. Otherwise, what it does is it compromises the performance of the model or the algorithm. Now, whatever we make, we always either underfit or overfit. Forget about these terms for now. Just think of errors as the difference between whatever you have predicted and whatever you're observing in reality. Now, whenever we study statistical errors in machine learning, most of us see this confusion matrix. So, confusion matrix is a part of measuring classification, accuracy, recall, and a ton of other metrics that can be derived from this. These two points at the opposite ends of the dice are your errors. The first one is called type 2 error, and the second one is called type 1 error. The reason I'm calling type 1 error the second error is because type 1 error is actually more important in most use cases in the real world than the type 2 error. It simply says that what you have predicted, positive or negative, is incorrect. But generally, whatever textbooks, most textbooks that you study machine learning from, most YouTube channels, and most other MOOCs that I have been a part of, generally do not show you that there are two components to any kind of error in a machine learning model. The first one is the
Kriti,
reducible error, which you can generally reduce by either improving the quality of your data or by improving the quality of your model. The second one is, okay.
so it's like the voice is breaking up. Maybe you can switch off your video so that you can use the bandwidth in presenting. Na? So, guys, let's wait for Kriti. She is facing some technical issues, and like she would be joining back. Kriti would be joining us soon. So, like, in the meanwhile, she is correcting her internet connectivity, and we hope we could be getting her soon on this platform.
Hey, I'm back.
Yeah, yeah, sure. So you can try
Yeah.
sharing your screen. Yeah, I will stop sharing.
Yes, that's all right. Pata nahi yaar, not a good day tech-wise again. This shouldn't happen.
We have been
Okay,
giving space for these things for the last 2 years.
I know, but shouldn't happen, right? I did not expect this to happen. Wait, let me move to that slide. Okay. Where did you lose me exactly?
So
Errors,
like
right?
you,
Okay.
yes, yes. Okay.
Okay. All right. Great. Sure. All right. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. Facing some connectivity issues, but I guess that's all right. So, I was talking about errors in machine learning models. So, most of us, when we study ML from textbooks, we know that there is a certain amount of error that a model will always make, no matter if you happen to make the best model in the universe. Generally, an error component can be broken down into two parts. The first one is the reducible error, and the second one is the irreducible error. Everything that we do, including reporting metrics and trying to play with our data and our algorithms, can only take us closer to the theoretical reduction of the reducible error. There is a component of irreducible error that no matter how hard we try, there is very less that we can do to minimize that. So, how do we make sure that the errors in our algorithms are as low as possible? When I say error, I'm not just talking about quantitative error, but error in a form that can affect someone's course of life or a course of future. I'll give a good example here. If you're watching on a device and most of you are a student, if it has ever happened to you that you applied to your dream company and within minutes you received a rejection email, most of the time in India, it generally happens because the ATS scans your resume for a few select set of institutions. If you're not from those institutions, they don't even bother pushing your CV through a human and having someone review your CV in person. You might be a good candidate otherwise, but an algorithm decides if you're good enough to apply or not before a human has a chance to look at it. I personally find that a huge problem, and as someone who's building these systems today, I try my best so that our algorithms do not discriminate on an unintended ground. Okay. So, we've talked a lot about how technology isn't perfect, but we always get by saying, okay, humans are not perfect. So, how are you expecting a human to make a machine that is near perfect? That is not the point. We do know that technology, any kind of technology by design, is designed to be near perfect. You wear shoes because you don't want your feet to come in contact with the ground on winter days or summer days. You drive from place A to place B because you cannot walk. We invent technology to make our lives easier, not to make our lives difficult. So, this is a very popular meme which says that humans are hooked, but machines are learning. So, if you see that this image shows a lot of people engaged in their smartphone, whereas there are a few robots that are learning to do things that are traditionally known as human tasks. Now, we say that this is a moment where machine learning is bad. No, that is not the point of this talk or any tech talk for that matter. The whole idea is to be aware that there is a possibility it can go in a direction it was not intended to, and how can we minimize the whole thing. So again, no matter how rational you or I believe ourselves to be, humans are not as rational as we believe ourselves to be. A very simple example of this one would be, you know, you're on a strict diet, but you will still eat if your favorite food is placed in front of you. I have a few examples here which I will explain how they leak into machine learning models and the data sets that we collect. I'll take a few in the interest of time. So we have written IKEA effect as the center point for this one. The IKEA effect in theory stands that you tend to overvalue an idea if you have worked on it yourself. Now, IKEA effect explains as to whatever you cook at home always tastes better than whatever you order at a fancy restaurant. It might not always be better, but it is a cognitive effect at play. The second one is framing effect. Our popular media uses this really nicely. Uh, you know that you're more likely to click on a news article if it has something negative or if it has something sensational. So they might frame something as simple as A killed B as, you know, they had this going on in their life and they had this going into their lives. That is an example of framing effect. The third one is recency bias. Now, this is an interesting one because it states that you tend to overvalue the information that you have recently learned as compared to information that is more further away in the past. So, that is as good as me saying that, okay, the Spanish flu was nowhere as bad as COVID, even though logically I was not even born when Spanish flu occurred. Uh, the next one is hindsight bias. It says that you operate from a place of knowing things that you know today and you project it onto your past self. So, this generally happens that after an examination, you might go to your friend and say, oh, you know what, I knew this would come, and that is the reason I studied it. Where in reality, short of time travel, there is no way for you to know what was asked in that examination. It was sheer luck. Uh, the last one in this list is something that we're talking about right now. It is automation bias. So consider a scenario that, for example, you are driving to a new city or a new place and you don't know how to reach there. So you ask a human that, okay, ask, tell me where to go and tell me how to go there. And I'll take an example wherein they told you they were not that aware of how do you reach where you wanted to go. So they just gave you some random bunch of directions in order to not look stupid. Now you ended up being at a place which is completely deserted. You'll be really angry at that person, and you will never ask that person for direction again. In fact, you might never ask another human for directions again because of that one incident. But if it so happens that you enter a location in Google Map and the location has closed down, that restaurant has closed down, second time you have to go for a direction, you will still try and look for it on Google Maps first. Automation bias, in nutshell, simply states that you are more likely to trust predictions if a machine says it than when a human says it. Uh, this is not to say that machines are always wrong or that humans are always right, but if a human and a machine are presenting the same information to you, you're more likely to trust a machine than a human, even though the machine might just be taking all the cognitive biases that we have talked about from a human and projecting it back to you. Okay, so now that we have taken a good look at all the cognitive and logical biases, let's talk about, since we're talking about risk management, before talking about model risk management and machine learning risk management, let's take a look at the risk management process in general. So, for those who know about it and for those who don't as well, in the world of finance, there is a certification called FRM. It is a highly coveted certification and it stands for Financial Risk Management. People spend years trying to clear that certification and it has a very low pass rate, like close to 29-30%. So, a lot of people who clear Indian examinations like CA, CAT, and all of those things still end up failing FRM. It is that hard of an examination. So, this excerpt is taken from there about how a risk management process is designed to be. It actually starts with risk identification. When risk identification, I mean that you make a list of all the potential risks taking a very 360-degree kind of a view and listing down all potential risks to an individual or to an entity. Again, if I take it as a COVID example, risk identification would entail, okay, if I go out, I might get COVID. If I don't wear a mask, I might get COVID. If someone of my family member or people who are close to me or someone who's visiting my house comes in contact with someone who has COVID, that is a risk factor to me as well. The second step is a risk assessment, wherein once you have a list of potential risks, and again, pay attention to the word of potential and the word possibility that we have seen in the definition of the risk, then you build a prioritized risk list. So I know that, okay, if I come in contact with someone who has COVID, I will get COVID, and if my family members get it, I will get it. But I can definitely wear a mask and I can stop going out in order to limit mine and my family's exposure to risk. So you prioritize the list. You decide that going out has to be the highest risk because the contact rate is much higher there, followed by making sure your family does not go out, making sure they wear masks, and all of those things. Now that I have a list of risks and a prioritized risk list, the third thing goes about risk planning. So, risk planning is about knowing protocols, knowing everything that you will need in case something happens to you, in case you contract COVID, and a contingency plan in case you actually contract COVID. So, you plan that, okay, this is the room in my house which I have designated for someone who has to home quarantine. This is a PPE kit which we have brought for the person who would attend to the person who has COVID if multiple people get it. This is where we will get our food from, making sure your health insurance is in place, and all of these things, they fall under risk planning. And the fourth one is a cyclic process, that is risk monitoring. So across this all these process, you continuously conduct a risk audit. You keep looking for, you know that these are the risks, you keep looking for indicators which might indicate that, okay, this is something that I need to do, and this might indicate that, okay, the thing that I built a contingency plan for has already happened. So if my mother starts to sneeze tomorrow or my brother has a fever, if I continuously monitor their temperature and their oxygen levels, I will know that, okay, I time to execute my contingency plan. So these are the four steps of a traditional risk management process. We will talk about how we do the same thing in a machine learning model in a while. So, building a contingency plan, there are a few standard accepted risk models that we have in place, which deal with how you manage risk. So, this is a very widely used one. It is called TARA model. It takes away the impact and the probability of a risk of an event happening, and it plots it into a 2 by 2 graph. Then we divide it into quadrants. The exact thresholds can vary by industry, and then it tells you what to do wherever your risk falls in. So, for example, if there is a low probability of something happening and there is a low impact, you just have to accept that this is a risk which has come with existing. So, an example of this could be that, if you kind of don't stay careful, there is a theft that can occur at your home. So, you know that there are very few thefts that happen in a country, and even if a theft happens, you can always buy whatever you have lost back. So, that is a risk you have to live with. You will not abandon your own home in the hopes that, okay, if I leave my home, there will be no risk of thefts to me. So you accept that risk. Next in the quadrant comes the transfer risk. Transfer risk refers to risks that are low in nature, but the impact that it can have is very high. Now, if I'm talking about a theft, think of it as a thief enters your home and it wants your laptop or your mobile phone. At that point in time, the best course of action would be to simply give it to them, to simply push the possibility of something happening on someone else so that you yourself can stay safe. Now, even if the probability is low, but the impact is high, easiest thing would be to transfer. Now, this actually explains why the IT service consulting industry in India has boomed like crazy, because a lot of Fortune 50, Fortune 100, Fortune 500 organizations have been outsourcing their risk functions to India. Indian Big Fours have dedicated risk capabilities. Indian consulting, the MBBs, and even companies like the listed ones, all of them have dedicated risk functionalities right now, simply because a lot of US and Europe corporations have been exporting all their risk to India, because the cost of doing most things here is lower, as well as the talent that you can find to manage the same risk is much plenty available, plus it's cheaper as well. So this explains the growth of our service IT industries. Now talking about avoid, if the probability of something happening is high and the impact is also high, we are all better off avoiding that risk. COVID definitely falls into avoid right now. And the last quadrant is the reduce one. So if the risk is low but the probability of something happening is high, what you can do is you can work on reducing your exposure to such situations. So one example of this one could be a flat tire. The impact of having a flat tire is very low, but if you're driving on a road which has stones, the probability of it happening is very high. So you might decide to take an alternate route, or you might decide to take a different vehicle or a different mode of transportation. So that is how Tara model works. It's very difficult in practice to determine as to what should I consider as low risk and what should I consider as high risk. And it is very difficult to actually quantify the impact of a risk as well. So in practice, we generally prioritize our risks in priority orders, like the way we discussed in the previous slide, that this is more of priority to me than this one. And then we position things relatively, that okay, both of them are low probability events, but one of them has a higher probability of happening than the other. So it's a very relative graph in nature. Okay. There is one more model that I want to talk about before we move forward, because this is something that most of us might have heard of and it hits very close to home. So it is called ALARP model. ALARP model is the acronym for this one. It says that in certain industries, you cannot reduce the risk to a bare minimum. So what we do is we try to get it as low as reasonably possible. And this is again a graph that you can see. You see that increasing individual risks go up, and the tolerance is defined on this particular scale. So that is the number of people that will be affected. A great example of this one would be in case of a nuclear attack or a nuclear war, wherein you know that okay, I cannot say for certain that no country in our lifetime would ever use an atom bomb, but let's at least agree to a bare minimum standards so that the risk of any country using a nuclear bomb is as low as possible. So we have guardrails around a lot of things like these. Even in war situations, we try to minimize the casualties that we have on both sides, a lot of other things. And this is mostly reserved for industries and for situations wherein reducing the risk is not completely possible. All right. So these are the two financial risk management techniques that are very widely used across industries, across verticals, across businesses. Now, talking about a few regulations and compliance acts in place, the reason we are talking about this is a lot of our work through machine learning and analytics is used to produce output for businesses and is consumed by businesses. Now, businesses by definition are heavily regulated. It could be via regulatory bodies, or it could be via their consortiums, or it could be legal or jurisdiction reasons. But there are a lot of regulations and compliances that are in place across the world. The first two examples that I mentioned here are the CCAR and DFAST models. These are not exactly models, but these are assessments that any bank making more than 10 billion USD a year has to undergo on a yearly basis. It basically ensures that the bank is strong enough to absorb the impact of any economic or political instability around the world. Now, Federal Reserve and Federal Bank controls all of these. In India, RBI controls a lot of things and regulations that we have in place for finance as a sector. Legal laws actually contain places, and they actually control places wherein you have regulations in place. The third one that I have mentioned is Fair Lending Compliance Standards. So, Fair Lending Act is an act which was passed in the US, ensuring that if people apply for credit, they shouldn't be discriminated against on the basis of age, gender, educational qualifications, and a few other criterias. Yet, whoever has worked in machine learning as a sector must have built at least one credit risk model at some point in their learning journeys or their career. And what variables do you get there? You generally get age, you generally get income, you generally get marital status. In practice, using any of those variables to predict if someone should be approved for credit or not might have you end up in a prison. The fourth one is GDPR. So GDPR is has come to light in 2018, and one great information right to information is included in GDPR. It simply says that if an automated algorithm has made a decision about you, and you have the decision with you, you have a right to know on what grounds was that decision made. So if I apply for a credit at a bank and it is rejected, I can go and demand that, okay, under my right to information, I need to know on what basis has this algorithm denied that I have been denied credit for. So those kind of things do exist, and this makes it more difficult to just blindly deploy models, and also to don't really blindly deploy it, but also to supply it with data continuously and to strike a balance between automation versus human in the loop. Now, EU did a fantastic job last year by releasing a 79-page white paper titled as EU AI Regulations. It basically regulates a lot of things apart from AI, like self-driving vehicles, autonomous systems, even crypto to a certain extent, but it lists out that this is the definition of algorithmic justice and this is the definition of algorithmic bias. If you are found in violation of any of these, you can be tried. Now, it is wonderful because it is a landmark in its own. A lot of other countries are catching up by passing their own AI regulations because EU has made it compulsory for people trading with the European Union to comply to these regulations. The last one is Personal Data Protection Bill. So Niti Aayog in 2019, headed by the bill actually was headed by the Information Communication Technology Minister at that point, released a draft for a personal data protection bill, which simply said that the data of Indian consumers and people and citizens would not be used for any other purposes rather than the purpose it was collected for without their prior permission. This is a landmark step. It got passed in around 2020, but it is still to be enforced in complete force. Niti Aayog actually also released a national AI strategy white paper last year and then before that 2018, which has a lot of potential if implemented correctly. So, as we move forward through a revolutionary industry, which is AI and machine learning, a lot of legal regulations have started to catch up, and it is imperative for us as practitioners to be mindful that, okay, I might not be doing something wrong today, but something that I built today or some data that I use today could be out of place tomorrow. All right. So now, having looked at why we interact with ML the way we do it, what is being done around the world to regulate it, as well as what is risk management in general, the next question that arises is that what can we do and what can be done to mitigate these risks? Now, we have already discussed that these risks are not something that we can completely eliminate, but we certainly can take steps to reduce these risks to a bare minimum. Now, let's start with data audit. So, what happens in a data audit is that you completely go through your data. And I know it sounds simple. Everyone who studies machine learning studies EDA, but I'm asking you to look at your data through a very devil's advocate kind of a point. Give you an example for this one. What happens is most of the times, if a company builds a ATS tracker or an ATS system, they generally train it on people who have been hired in the past, And if they continue to hire from a very small subsection of the society, the model will pick up those biases simply because the training data it had those biases, and it will continue to perpetually perpetuate that bias. So the best way to avoid it is at the root of it, which is the data. Now, these are a few questions that can help you answer as to if your data is good enough to train a model with. The first one is the training data that you're giving to a model true reflection of the population? An example for this one could be if you build a classifier that predicts how likely you are to get into a car accident. Of course, you will not take people who have died across all sorts of accidents in the country in the last 5 years, because you are specifically looking at car accidents. It's possible that that person died in a bus accident or a train accident, something like that. In that case, your training data, you might get more training data, but your training data is not a true reflection of this population that you would be deploying the model on. The second one, and this is the most important one on this list if you ask me personally, is that is the data collection methodology reliable? So again, let me know in the section, chat section or something. I have done this personally. If you have been asked to publish a research paper in college or for a conference, how do you collect your data? You float out a Google form and you ask your friends to fill that, and you ask your friends to circulate it. So in that case, it kind of stays within a geographical limit. You do not get a complete data. So the methodology itself might not be incorrect, but just because the way it reaches and the way it is designed, the data that you have collected happens to represent a very small section of population. A great example of this one is medical field. So we all know that the Nazi concentration camps actually, and the World War II medical camps, even no matter how horrific they were very horrific. They have conducted horrendous experiments on live people, on prisoners of war, on people who were caught in those camps. And most of the what we know about our medical fields, about surgery, about how internal damage occurs and how humans heal from things, is basis the data that those people collected. Now, that kind of data collection methodology might not be ethically permitted today, and in a true sense, it is, but we do have enough data to simulate that if needed. Now, that kind of methodology is not something that is reliable, but a lot of the data science work that we are doing, we are training our model on the data that is available to us, falling to the recency bias. Uh, Another example of this one could be that for COVID mortality reporting, for a long time in most of our Indian countries and cities, they were not counting the death toll that was received in private hospitals. Not just the death toll, but even the official cases. So, unless you're going to a government hospital, you never made it to the top of the statistics. So, is the methodology through which you're collecting data reliable enough? Is a good question to ask before trying to build any model. The third question is the second most important one, which is, will this data drift in near future? Now, most of you must be familiar with the concept of data drift. Data drift simply states that the data itself has changed in properties on which model was trained. So, for example, if you train a model which is trained on the data of 2020 first half for India versus 2020 second half, you will notice a considerable difference, because we started with vaccinations in 2020 second half and 2021. So that was a huge data drift that occurred. So naturally, whatever trends, whatever coefficients the model might have picked up in the first half may no longer hold true, simply because the underlying data has changed. Now, sitting today, it is a good question to ask that if I'm building an ATS parser, that will this data drift in near future? Now, we all know that in the setup of remote learning, a lot of people have started to go back to online learning modes. People sitting in India can finish a degree from Harvard, Oxford, or Stanford at the comfort of their own home and get a certificate which is equivalent to spending that much of time in the future. So that is an example of a data drift. Now, how do I want my model to perform in the data drift is a part of the contingency plan that we build, but that is something we need to be mindful of. The fourth one is a very important one again. It is, what was the motivation that anyone who collected this data had? When I say motivation, think of it, if I want to prove a certain hypothesis, and this happens a lot in political discussions or social discussions. If I have a friend who happens to like Marvel versus another friend who happens to like DC. If I have to build a model that will predict something around DC, I will go and talk to the friend who is a DC fan, because I want my data to reflect what I think. That is a data collection designed with a specific goal in mind. I might never go to the Marvel fan and ask them about, what do you think of this part? So my motivation becomes a core about data collection, and someone looking at that data would not be able to figure out what is going on with that data. The next one is, did anyone who collected his data follow a scientific experiment design process, or they just went with whatever is convenient? The methodology discussion still holds true. I have done this. I have filled surveys for friends and asked them to fill surveys for me. That is not a scientific process. Of course, that helps me pass the course, but it will never help me reach a true judgment. And the last question is a very devil's advocate kind of a question. It is, what can possibly go wrong if I do not follow good data audit practices? Um, Chances are, if a model is not very high stake, you will probably not face much consequences. But what if it is very high stake and you happen to be the reason someone doesn't get a job? Okay. Now, followed by data audits, we have model audits. So, model audits generally come into picture once a model has been built. How model audits mitigate risk is, if you're mindful of your model's shortcoming, because a model at its core is again a machine. I like to think of a model as a machine, and you never touch your refrigerator or your washing machine or any other electric appliance at your home if your hands are wet or if there is water in any part of your body. That's just a natural part of how we have learned to deal with these machines. So we need to deal with our models in a similar fashion. A few questions that we can ask are, first one starts with, is the model using a correct metric for evaluation? When I say metric, think of it as evaluating a model on error might not be the best idea. There could be a lot of other metrics using which I can assess the model performance. The second one would be, is the model fair to protected classes? When I say protected classes, think of it as any kind of classes that have been disadvantaged by design. Uh, the third one is, can I use this model in a high stake situation? So I roll my eyes anytime someone says that you can predict the crime, or you can predict the probability of a crime occurring in a certain area using a machine learning model. It's simply not possible. The data that you have collected in most cases is designed by law to have only convicted cases. You lose out a lot, and a lot of crimes that we know of are underreported. I mean, if something happens to me or if a theft happens at my place, how many of us go and lodge an FIR? Very few of us do. So those models are typically not very great to be used in a high stake situation. The fourth one is, when should I retrain this model and refresh this model? Uh, that is a good question to ask, because we have talked about data drift in the past. So, for example, if I built a COVID model, if I built a model to predict the spread of COVID, a good retraining time would be when vaccination had started. And a good refresh frequency means that keeping the underlying model the same but refreshing the data itself. Timing to do that would be on some basis defining some metric and doing a statistical process control. If the process seems to be changing, that's when you refresh the model and observe the results again. The last one is about, does the model comply with whatever local or industry specific laws there are in practice? So we have talked about fair lending compliance. If you're building a credit risk model, is your model you're building complying with that kind of an act or not? Because you might not see it, but unintending bias can creep up in that model, and it can actually have legal implications for the employer, for you, and for a lot of other people. the example of a local specific law here would be that a couple of places in Europe have totally specified that no data can be collected from their citizens for facial recognition purposes across the globe. So that is a local compliance that you have to keep in mind. If you find data set that is collected without their explicit consent, you either inform the local authorities or you simply discard it from your particular data set, because then that becomes a huge problem. Okay. The third is sparking human centric discussions. So, ethical AI, responsible AI, and risk management is something which is highly spoken of because 2008 financial crisis happened. Before 2008 financial crisis, people rarely spoke about financial risk at the scale at which they do now. So let's not wait that we run into a similar situation for AI as well and then spark these discussions. Start talking to people about responsible AI, about ethical AI, about explainability and interpretability in ML systems. I know these people at Kaggle Days hosted a session on interpretability, which was taken by a college senior of mine. So start taking these sessions, start attending these sessions, start talking to people that you know of who work in these fields, start to question the status quo. And that is how we will start to have human centric discussions with humans at core of a model. Because you can be the best data scientist in the world, but do you want to be the one who happens to build something that causes damage at a scale of a nuclear weapon or at a scale of an atomic bomb? I don't want to be that person, and I know that most people don't want to be that person. There are a few steps that we can take. I'll just leave it at one step right now, in the interest of time. The first one is critical thinking. This is something that we're not taught in our education system. That's something we need to develop on our own. Critical thinking asks a very important question, which is who benefits? No matter what I'm doing right now, who benefits from what I'm doing? Who benefits from what I don't do? And who benefits if I don't do anything right now? And the last one is ensuring stakeholder diversity. So, an example of this one could be that rapid antigen tests generally are not as accurate because they were tested on people that was a very small representation of the entire population. So, ensuring that stakeholders in the model development and machine learning process have diversity itself can take out a lot of kinks from the process. Involving domain experts, being mindful of all the prejudices that you or I might hold, formulating proper strategies, AI data strategies, and implementing it are all ways to execute it. But the first step is to spark these discussions. Uh, yeah, that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. Thanks.
Thank you, Kriti, for such an awesome session and giving a lot of insights around various type of models and kind of various type of methodologies that we go around for risk management. So it's like we had a few questions the community
Sure,
members had put us like had sent us via mail because of time zone differences
sure.
that we would love to discuss. So it's like a lot of freshers, like this was a common question that we got from a lot of freshers. It was like,
Right,
like it was like we are starting with AI, we are starting with data science, we are starting with ML, but it's like when we are
right.
doing ML, we are doing AI, we are more specifically focused towards just getting an internship, just getting a job, and in that pursuit we tend to deviate from our path of this ethical AI or interpretability or explainability, right? Like that is fair at their part also, because the college curriculum and the things that they're part of maybe force them, or maybe due to time paucity they need to go that way. So it's like, what would be your suggestion? Because this was a quite a common question by two or three community members who asked, and most of them were freshers. So like, how to balance this? Like you mentioned that critical thinking and kind of things, like whenever you approach a problem statement, try to use your thinking. So that was a really good point. But still, like if someone wants to go like let's say a first year student or a second year student who's starting with ML AI, now he has two things to keep in mind, right? Like not only build a machine learning model, but also build something which is really good, which is really useful for the community, or rather than just building a model which just stays in your machine, or even if that model sees the light of real world, that may go to destructive activities, right? So how would you suggest to that fresher or kind of a first year or second year student?
That is a great question and really well articulated. So I'll tell you an example again. So most of the times, anyone who hires a data scientist, I'm talking a data scientist and not a machine learning intern or something. Most of the time, I hire as well. Most of the time, we are looking for people who are problem solvers at core. I have all the due respect for technical skills for everyone, and I know a few people have awesome technical skills and they have amazing portfolio of projects and they have great CV credentials to get every job that they want to. But one more thing that they can add to their entire portfolio is again the example that I see credit risk model in every single resume, almost every single resume that I scan myself. What we see there is if you have mentioned I did a credit risk model, achieved benchmark score of 99.7% accuracy there. My first question to that person is why did you choose accuracy and not recall in this case? Because banks generally do not really give out credit to everyone freely. If your event rate, like if 100 people apply and only 10% get the loan, I might as well 90% becomes my baseline accuracy. I might label everyone as deny credit to everybody, do not give anybody any credit, and that accuracy itself becomes 90%. Recall in this case is a better metric simply because it measures out of the 10% people who got credit, how many people did you actually predict that they would get the credit. So that demonstrates two things to me. The first thing is this person understands the problem they are dealing with, plus they also understand the implications this model might have down the line for credit risk in particular. Another example is Titanic is also a problem that you see in almost every second machine learning resume. Now people will I've written things like that in my resume. I built a Titanic classifier. Now all of us have seen Titanic. We knew that a guy just got on the deck and said all the women and kids start to board those boats, and that has leaked into the model as well. What people do is they go and they engineer that if the gender is female, then you know what, just put her on a lifeboat, so women have more probability of surviving Titanic. Now my question to such people is, if a Titanic like disaster happens tomorrow, do you think women are still more likely to survive than men? Now that questions two things. The first thing is letting women escape for the first time was a call that was taken on the moment. It was not something that a model can predict sitting today again. And the second thing being, what if the ship only has men? And they say, okay, let's put every woman on the boat and have them escape, then no men will survive. So those critical thinking skills help you in every single interview that you give. A lot of these interviews these days have case study rounds. I did one case study round wherein the case study was very simple. The case study simply said that, okay, you have 10 stores, you have to choose to close three of them. Which ones would you close? A naive approach would be that build a model about drivability distance and close the ones wherein very few people come in. Now if someone takes that approach, that is fine, that there is no problem with that. But going a step further in most cases is what that differentiator in your resume is. So if you want to build a resume, if you want to build a classifier, sure, go for it. But make sure that you're also aware of the shortcomings of your process, because that will show anyone or your prospective employer that you're a problem solver. You can debug, you can learn, you can relearn, you can adapt. So yeah, that would be it.
Yeah, makes sense, makes sense. So it's like I could really relate, like when you mentioned this, the common projects that you see on the resumes, and then students ask that I have also done this project, the other student has also done this project, but how come we are two different, like how come I am treated not like him, or how does the application process differs? So actually good thing that we mentioned it, like around how should we actually focus onto these things. So coming to this ethical AI part, it's like a lot of things have gone like haphazard in the last 2 years, if we say, right? So it's like there we
Yeah.
have seen most data sets being generated, or a lot of data that we have not even seen in the past. or like it's a like, let's say if we had to forecast something, or if we had to do something on credit or something like that, like in India you had this for MSME sector, you had this loan from Indian government kind of things. So like then
Yes,
it would, then you would not be able to 100% rely on the previous data, then that how the things were, because the condition was
agreed.
totally different. So it's like coming to that, we also have this reinsurance domain, like insurance for insurance kind of things that we. So one of the folks who is from this reinsurance domain, he like I do not know the gender, but I'm referring to, it's a community member. They ask that when it comes to reinsurance, how do we make sure that the model that we have made is ethical? Because there are benchmarks, and the thing I think it's like a very subjective question. Like it depends on the use case, right? Like what you think is the optimal, I would say, explainable AI for you at your position, right? So how would you tackle that if someone is working in a reinsurance industry or a reinsurance domain?
That's a great example again that you have brought up. So I'll tell you the same thing about MSMEs. So I happened to study at an institution wherein MSME had set up SIDB, and SIDB generally gives out loans to small scale to medium scale entrepreneurs. Now, if you know anyone who has taken a loan, most of the times in India, you will hear people saying, okay, don't take the loan on your name, take a loan on your mother's or your sister's or your wife's name. The interest rate would be lower, the collateral requirement would be lower, etc., etc. How that comes into picture is, historically and even right now, women make less money than men do, and these benchmarks are generally set on your income criteria. Women in India, it's a patriarchal society, very few women own properties and a lot of those things. So the government passed laws which allowed women to also inherit the properties from their dads and the ancestral properties, and they inherit that tax free. Even today, if I want to gift something to my brother, he won't be taxed for it. The same might not hold true if there are two brothers involved. So those things were put into practice, and now it has creeped into our system so badly that we hear people taking advantage of it all the time. Now, talking about reinsurance as a sector, insurance again is a heavily regulated industry, a very heavily regulated ones. You cannot discriminate basis the gender, but of course, insurance companies find their own ways. How reinsurance, I have seen how reinsurance mostly works is, they target people who don't either, they either don't get through the standard insurance process, or the limits that they get are very low. So we generally look for people in reinsurance who have a very low probability and also low to medium impact of being impacted by something adverse. An example for this one would be, if you're buying a ticket of IRCTC, you will see that Royal Sundaram has added a travel insurance there. Now, you know the probability of something happening to you during a train journey is extremely low, but you don't mind paying that less than a rupee. Think of how much money they're clocking in just from that. So, from a reinsurance perspective, if you have to build a model, you also have to consider the data source that you're using. Your data set will come from insurance companies, and insurance companies on their end have already screened out risky candidates. If there were 90 candidates that were risky and 10 who were not, they have already screened 90 out. You're only working with the 10 remaining data sets. So you have to find a way to bring a representation of those 90 back into your data set if you don't want to lose money. Because otherwise, your model will start to predict that, okay, this person is not risky, this person is not risky for everyone. A great example of this one is health insurance plans. So if you buy a health insurance for someone who is a senior citizen or someone's parents through a private insurance factor, you will see that the premium is super high. Premium is 25, 30K, more so if they have pre-existing conditions, right? But if you happen to go through an employer insurance route, your premiums reduce by 50%. Now, that generally happens because you're employed with a company and they know that at the very least you will continue to pay the premium simply because you're employed. A senior citizen by themselves may or may not be able to pay. They might pass away without paying, and then that whole thing is dissolved, because in India, your liabilities do not pass away unless it has been pre signed. So, that is one thing that I would keep in mind if you ask me to build a reinsurance model as to where is my data set coming from.
Got it, got it. So that's a useful point, like keeping into mind, keeping the model approach kind of holistically good, so that it doesn't discriminate on something or kind of other factors. So like keeping into consideration the time, we will be taking up the last question, and it would be like you have started working on ethical AI, and a lot of other things have been happening into ethical AI domain, right? But it's like
Right.
still we think a lot of work needs to be done, or we need to put awareness around this a lot more than we are doing right now, so that we build a responsible data scientist, I would say. Like today we are becoming data scientists,
Right.
but 2 years down the line we would want more responsible data scientists, or who really understands what they're doing, not just building the models or kind of things. So what resources would you suggest? So like I would not say that any book or any blog kind of things. Definitely the community meetups, not only ask, like a lot of other community events are also being happening around explainability.
Right.
And we hosted Tanvi, who is your schoolmate, or I do not know, like a batchmate. So
College
like she
mate.
also, yeah, college mate. So she
College
also
senior
spoke
actually.
on,
Yeah.
yeah. So she also talked about it, but we think that there needs to be a little bit more push, because it's like it, otherwise things start dying down. Like maybe some folks come and attend this session, but three months down the line they might be again back to the back to the things that they are doing currently. So what would be your suggestion around resources, or where people should visit, or maybe like how to approach to learn more about ethical AI and explainability?
All right, that's again a good question because when we in the world of physical meetups, when as and when they used to happen, a lot of people used to walk up to us and ask that, okay, I am very interested in doing responsible AI and ethical AI, but how do I go about it? Because it's not something that you find material for easily. One great thing that I have seen is mostly Kaggle has course, a micro course on ethical AI. It's about model interpretability and explainability in general, but it is a good starting point. Other than that, a lot of legal courses have added algorithmic justice, algorithmic bias, all of those terms to their repertoire. So that's a great person and great point to learn these things from. Next is you can always read about case studies as to why some algorithms worked and why some algorithms did not work. So ethics is one part of it, but a part of traceability and explainability also is to figure out where your model went wrong so that it does not go down that route again. Another example for this one would be Mahindra started testing autonomous vehicles, and 2 days running on UP roads, the system died down. So that kind of that kind of thorough testing is necessary if you want to look into those kind of resources. But before that as well, if you're building a model, think about it that if this model is to make that same decision that you're making it for your life, would you want it to be wrong than right more often than not? And that is in more often than not is enough to bring in that perspective as to how the end user might be consuming it. So an example for this one could be this ATS that I was talking about. Now if I build an ATS and I let that IIT/IIM thing creep into it, that ATS might end up rejecting me tomorrow. Do I want that happening to me? That's a good starting point. Then it goes on from there, and we have been here in IT, in software development. That's how these cyber risk, cyber security functions have come up. 5 years down the line, ethical AI risk management will start to have a lot of more traction in the country. At the moment it doesn't exist, but Google and Facebook have already set up fair AI practices. Google has a separate department dedicated to ethical AI. How ethical are their workings is another question, but they already have it. So people have started to do things around here. It's great to get involved. Yeah, thanks.
Yes, so like that really is reflecting in the conferences that we are having, right? Like the lot of conferences that are having virtually, they have this responsible AI and ethical AI, I would say, section in that entire conference schedule.
Yes.
So that definitely gives a sense that we are working towards it, and this is really a great step towards becoming responsible data scientists or responsible machine learning engineers in the time to come, right? So that we at least become more responsible to what we are doing, because what we are doing is completely on the base of data and kind of things, and we could not be doing injustice to someone just because we have the power of using Jupyter notebooks and Python, right? So I hope this is useful for the community. Thanks to all of you for joining, and thanks Kriti for giving us your valuable time and helping the community members understand and taking up a few questions from them. Thank you, all of you, and stay safe. Bye bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.